When you're selling your home and you've gotten to the point where you've come to an agreement with the buyer, most people think the hard part is over at that point and don't realize what's to come next. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what to expect and what happens after you open escrow. Most escrows average about 30 to 45 days here in Southern California, and it's during that time that a lot can go wrong and the deal could potentially fall apart. Most sellers never even see it coming. Not knowing what to expect can really cost you. Some lose their buyer entirely. Others end up having to drop their price because of unexpected surprises that came up during the process. You don't actually have a done deal until you get that call that the buyer's funds are in escrow and you're set up to record with the county. So, what actually happens in those 30 to 45 days? There are several big benchmarks to know about, and your buyer's offer has contingency periods built into the contract to protect your buyer's earnest money deposit, which needs to be wired into escrow within 3 days. The biggest hurdles are the inspection contingency, appraisal and loan contingencies, title search, review of reports, and now there's even a contingency for insurance to allow your buyer enough time to make sure that they can obtain insurance for your home or your property. It's important that your agent tightens up these time periods during the negotiations so that the buyer doesn't drag their feet and hang you up for weeks on end. Once all the parties have come to an agreement and you have an accepted offer, then your agent will open escrow. And yes, in Southern California, we use escrow companies. And escrow then orders the preliminary title report. That's the first step. This is super important because the title search will make sure that you're the clear and legal owner of the property and that no one else has a claim. Sometimes old unpaid property taxes can result in a lien against the property, or legal disputes tied to the home pop up that nobody knew about. Any one of these issues or clouds against title would need to be resolved before the sale can close, because you have to deliver clear title to the buyer. One of the biggest contingencies that I mentioned earlier is the home inspection. This is a big one, and if it isn't handled properly, it can mean the deal can go sideways. The buyer or buyer's agent will typically arrange for a professional home inspector to come and inspect your property from top to bottom and note everything they find that is either a safety hazard, systems that are failing or in disrepair, items that are inoperable, things that are maybe not working properly or nearing the end of their life. And my personal favorite is calling out what's not to code by today's standards. This one is always fun because we have to explain to the buyer that they are not buying a brand new home in many cases, and things that were to code when it was installed or when the house was built is not going to be to code by today's standards in most cases. And no, the homeowner is not responsible to bring the home up to today's code standards. Once the buyer receives the inspection report, they can come back and ask you to either fix some things, ask for credit towards repairs, or lower the price, or they could decide to just completely call it and walk away. Side note, even though the contract clearly states that the seller is not responsible to make any repairs, and even if you state during the negotiations that you want this to be an as-is sale, be prepared that buyers may get spooked at this point by the reality of what they're buying, and they still could ask for some sort of credit or concession. The next contingency is the buyer's appraisal. This is only if your buyer is obtaining financing. Your buyer's mortgage lender is going to hire or contract an independent appraisal company to conduct a walkthrough and inspection to determine the value of your property for the bank. If that number comes in lower than the price you agreed on, the bank may not approve the full loan. If that happens, then one of four things can occur. One, the buyer agrees to cover the gap, which can happen, especially if the buyer is putting a large down payment on the property, and that would be the best outcome. 2, you and the buyer could agree to meet somewhere in the middle if the gap is too large for the buyer to bridge on their own. 3, the buyer's agent tries to renegotiate the price and you agree to adjust it to the appraised value that came in. 4, you just can't come to an agreement and the buyer cancels. It's important to understand that even if your buyer waives their appraisal contingency, which can happen during multiple offer situation, they might do that to make the offer seem more appealing. That doesn't mean that the lender won't require an appraisal. Waiving the appraisal contingency just means that your buyer can't use an appraisal gap as a reason to back out or try to renegotiate. All of these big benchmarks should start happening as soon as escrow opens. Expect that you could be renegotiating once or twice during the escrow process. My tip is this: make sure your listing agent stays on top of the buyer's agent to get the inspection and the appraisal scheduled within the first couple days of opening escrow. Ideally, you want both things to happen as soon as possible. If the buyer submits something called a request for repairs, asking for repairs or concessions towards some repairs, my advice is this: try not to respond until you know that the appraisal is in at full value. You want to make sure that you don't have an appraisal issue. The reason I say this is because if you end up having to renegotiate on price because of a low appraisal, then you'll want that concession to also be part of your negotiation for any repairs, and really make one concession or price drop to cover all of it. So now that you know how much happens during the escrow process and how many things could potentially go wrong, do you see why it's critical to hire a listing agent with experience who can help keep everything moving forward smoothly and on track? Remember that there are a lot of loopholes in the contracts, and one missed or unchecked box could put you at risk and end up costing you, especially in Southern California. This is exactly when having an experienced real estate agent in your corner really makes a difference. Not because the process is impossible, but because the stakes are high and the decisions are time sensitive. Remember, accepting an offer on your home does not mean the deal is done. The fun is just getting started.